A special Arnold report on state expenditures next on Behind the Headlines.
This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, welcome to a new edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. And today we're very fortunate in that we're going to have Mr. Ed Arnold with us for the entire show for a special edition of the Arnold Report. Ed, welcome.
Good to see you, Charlie.
Of course, Mr. Arnold is the chairman of Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy and is the former owner of Arnold Trucking and New Penn Trucking and Arnold Logistics, and probably one of the top business people in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in the United States, and certainly who understands the transportation industry as well or better than anyone. Well, last time you were on the Arnold Report, we talked about the state budget, Ed, and we talked specifically about the revenue side. On this show, we'd like to, as we promised our viewers, talk about the expenditures side. I know you've done a little bit of analysis and you've looked at the state budget as proposed by Governor Corbett. What are the major areas of expenditures as proposed by the governor for this go-round?
Well, actually, they're the same as they've been for a long time. First of all, I want to explain a little bit that we really have sort of two budgets. One is what thing we call the general fund, which is about $27 billion, which is really most of what the legislator can theoretically address. And the other is the overall budget, which includes money, a tremendous amount of money from the federal government, and your fuel taxes and all your special funds, which again, they're pretty well designated where the money goes. So therefore, really both budgets, the overwhelming area that dominates our budget in Pennsylvania and in the country, for that matter, is welfare. Welfare under the basic budget, which is the $27 billion, is $11.2 billion or 41%, and actually it's even worse if you take the total budget because most of the federal money goes to welfare. Our larger budget, $64 billion, is almost 50% welfare. And one statement I want to make here is that our welfare situation is getting worse. We keep doing the same thing. Well, now I understand this is a quote.
And what do you mean by doing the same thing?
Well, we basically incent people not to work. We incent people because the more children you have, the more money you get.
And it's an interesting observation that Jamestown, when it was founded by the English, was failing. And John Smith finally made the unpopular decision that if you wanted to eat, you had to work. And everyone had to contribute. And sort of welfare became workfare at Jamestown, and Jamestown succeeded.
Well, it's interesting that we consider that Franklin Roosevelt was a very liberal president. He did not believe in welfare. He had only workfare. He created a lot of work programs, but there was nobody that got welfare. And basically in business, if a person is injured on workman's comp, we will find light-duty work to make them come back to the job, to keep the repetition of coming to work. And basically, well, if I got to come to work anyways, then I might as well do my job, and they'd come back to work and get off of workman's comp. Our government, they make it easy. Now they're depositing, I understand, on your account. You don't even have to cash a check. That make it easy to sit at home and do nothing and have the government give you money. Again, the insanity of what we have here is if you do the same thing over and over again and you keep getting the same results and you're surprised. No, welfare breeds welfare.
Well, this is one thing that when I was many years ago was the research director with the Commonwealth Foundation, we found that we did one of the first major papers on welfare reform that the Clinton administration, the Republican Congress was doing at the time. And we got a call from the welfare secretary from the Casey administration. And Governor Casey at that point, for whatever reason, wouldn't admit that government programs all had incentives, that they all affected human behavior one way or the other. Finally, by the end of his second term, I believe that he finally did admit that and recognize that, acknowledge that publicly.
I mean, I don't know how many of you have read the book Freakonomics, but Freakonomics has one simple theme. You get what you incent. Mm-hmm. People, when you incent people to do something, they will do it. It works. Unfortunately, in this case, welfare works very well. You incent people not to work, and they'll be glad to sit at home and do nothing. And the thing that surprised me in this budget is that when our governor campaigned, he said, and also actually he was agreed upon by Mr. Wagner, who was the Auditor General, there's at least $1 billion of waste in our welfare program. That under our previous administration, there was extremely liberal rules to how you got on welfare, and just generally it was administered on the basis of how much can we pay out. Yet here we are in a new administration. Instead of reducing welfare, we picked up the entire government part that the federal government isn't stimulating anymore, and we've increased it.
Do you have any idea why that happened under this new administration?
No.
Is it just because lack of time to study it and to change things, or that is a surprising development with the new administration?
No, I am totally baffled. I mean, it just we know there's waste, and we're cutting back on other areas. I mean, the next biggest area, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is education. And here there's been a very strong stand taken against it. Well, why wasn't a simple stand taken also against welfare? And I just don't know. It makes absolutely no sense to me.
You know,
I mean,
one of the forward to having the governor on and asking him.
Yeah, that would be very good. I mean, one of the areas they did not particularly increase the money for is job training. Well, again, if we were to revolutionize, and I don't know if a state can totally do this, but really force workfare. I mean, if nothing else, you want to get paid welfare, you're going to have to come sweep the streets. You're going to have to do something. And since we do have a lot of dirty streets in the cities, well, I guess that would be good. And then maybe you'd go want to find a job, because you wouldn't like that.
Yeah, I stayed in Lucerne, Switzerland, and Zurich some years ago, and I remember at about 4 o'clock in the morning, the city streets were filled with men and women in orange jumpsuits with long-handled brooms. They literally swept the streets by hand. They were very clean, and those people had a job. They may have been on welfare, but they had to come out and they had to do that.
Well, it's still done today. Paris is a very clean city because literally the streets are swept at least once a day, and that is paid for actually by the federal government. In fact, some areas I understand it's swept more than once a day. That, again, if that's what it takes, rather we're giving them the money anyway, so therefore, why don't we make them do something? And that would encourage you to go find a regular job, because maybe you don't like sweeping streets. And yet all we do is sit at home and we'll pay you, and especially to have large families. So really, that is our first area, and really one of the areas that there is things that we should work on. I don't know the nitty-gritties of it, but obviously that this incentive to have children and get paid more and more. Now, how do you do that? How do you get better quality training? Again, let's think outside the box and work at some, do something a little drastic, but make people come to work.
Well, let's turn to education.
Here is an area where, again, why have we done what we've done? In that we're not thinking outside the box. What can we do to make our schools better? We're complaining right now that education costs too much, and it does cost a lot. But what is far worse, and we're complaining but not nearly as loudly, is how its achievements are continuing. Pennsylvania definitely has, if it's not the highest between our benefits and our wages, the highest paid education people in the country, or at least in the top 10%. Yet our results are more in the bottom 10%. It's not working. So therefore, we've been doing the same thing over and over again. I mean, one of the things that we had talked about privately, we had said that right now in the United States, we teach less hours than any other of the developed countries.
Time on task, that if we want to improve education, that one of the best things that we could do is actually have the children spend more time studying their lessons.
I mean, basically, at this particular moment, we see where charter schools and there's other special, let's say, new schools that are being formed. But one of the criteria of them is, there's actually really two major criteria. Number one, they go a lot more hours. They tend to go 8 hours a day or close to that, and they also sometimes come to school on Saturday. But they also have parents' involvement. Well, again,
parental involvement is key, isn't it?
Well, again, when you see when schools are doing better, Catholic schools generally are doing better than public schools. Why? Because parents have to sacrifice to send their kids there. It costs them money, and they make sure they're getting something good. Actually, there's a very interesting book that was written about schools in the third world, and the government schools are terrible. They're paid for, they're unionized, they're basically, the teachers don't do a very good job, but in the slums, they actually have private schools. And the private schools are the ultimate entrepreneur in that the people are very poor, but they want their kids to get an education. Well, a teacher starts a small school, he knows he won't keep his customers if he doesn't give them their money's worth, because they're really working hard to give them the money. And ironically, most of these horrible core slums, the public schools don't go in there. They say it's not nice, so they don't go there. They were on the edges, but not inside. And actually these schools, this book was very interesting because it was written by I'm going to say a do-gooder who was there to help from England and try to help the public schools, and he realized that so many of the aid agencies were not really addressing the problem, and he started to go actually into the area and address the problem. But the incentive was, if you provide me a good education, I will pay you. And therefore, again, in America, we know monopolies are not very good. Our public school system is monopoly. And so therefore, to have incentive type schools where you actually, again, in colleges, our colleges are generally better than our regular school. There's not a monopoly.
No,
you can go to
choice.
One of 10,000 just about.
And then again, what many folks in America forget over and over again, we are the only developed country in the world that doesn't have educational choice. When I took my family to England several years ago, we had a choice of all the various schools around the city we lived. And we were interviewed, and we interviewed them, and we selected a school. And all the schools had all your information on the computer, so you could access that before you applied to one or the other.
Now, were these all public schools?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But you could go to which public schools?
You could go to whatever public schools you wanted to, or to a private school. The choice was yours, and it turned out to be a good experience. But this is true in every developed country in the world except the United States.
Yeah, and therefore, why we haven't learned, now we've been doing the same thing over and over again now for over 100 years, and obviously the outcome is getting very weak. But the one statement I think you had made is if we went to school as many hours as the Japanese go to school, we'd actually go to school for 5.5 years more the way we do it. Because that's the few hours that we go. We have the shortest number of days and the shortest number of hours.
And don't go Saturday and don't go year-round. Let's take a break here, and we'll be right back with Ed Arnold and the Arnold Report, and we'll continue to talk about state expenditures and education. We'll be right back after this.
Behind the Headlines is sponsored in part by Connections Academy.
If you were going to build a school around your kid, how would you do it? Fewer distractions? More attention from the teacher? More flexible schedule? More parental involvement? We're Connections Academy, a free online public school that creates a learning experience more focused on your child. Help your child make a stronger connection to learning at Connections Academy.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania Business Council, envisioning a commonwealth in which residents enjoy a very high quality of life in sustainable communities. The Council works aggressively to define key long-term policy strategies and solutions that make the Commonwealth more competitive, creating and sustaining a better Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by Daily Express, transporting construction, farm, and industrial equipment throughout the United States. And by Penn Waste, your best local choice for your waste removal and recycling needs.
Penn Waste is proud to be a locally owned business. Since the company's founding in 2000, it has employed many of its neighbors as members of a dedicated team of professionals. Penn Waste is proud of its many contributions to the people of its service area through support of numerous community organizations such as Christmas Addicts and the Junior League of York. One more way they improve the quality of life where they live and work.
Hi, welcome back to the second segment of Behind the Headlines. On this edition of the Arnold Report, we have Ed Arnold, who is talking about the expenditure side of the governor's proposed budget. We were talking about education, Ed, and we were talking about ways to improve education. What was the next item that you had on your list?
Well, basically, we just talked about how we have such a short learning season, I guess I could put it that way.
Short
The fact
school
that-
year.
That the number of hours, number of days.
Short school day.
And we go back to, well, why is it the way it is? In the rest of the world, one of the problems we have here is that the summer is so long that the people are off. They have to relearn a certain amount by the time they come back because they're off for basically 3 months. In most of the world, they have it's broken up that you're off 3-4 weeks at a time.
They have
you don't
year-round
have
school.
to relearn. It's year-round school. It uses the classroom better. And the reason we are the way we are is because in our founding, and when we first set up our public schools, we were a farm community. We were agriculture. The kids had to work in the summertime on the farms.
We were an agrarian society.
That is not what we have today. So looking at the rest of the world and what they've achieved, it would seem more practical if we were to spread our year into maybe 3 periods, have a break of something in the area of 3-4 weeks, and therefore the children would their number one job of growing up is to go to school and learn.
So the children don't forget nearly as much as they do.
That's correct. So basically we're talking
Now.
about a productive situation where the more you're in school, the more you're going to learn. One of the other areas is our area of tenure. Again, it was made to address a problem where the teachers could be fired arbitrarily by their superiors, and so we had to give them protection. Well, today, it is a total, let's say, a crutch or a weakness because it's not administered properly. Number one, it's very quick. In the college level, you have tenure after 5 years.
That's
In our
correct.
schools, we have it after 3.
And that was an improvement made by the Ridge administration. Before that, it was only 2 years.
And but even forgetting about how long it would be, when over 90% of the teachers are given tenure, in Florida they did attempt to actually change the rules because they had districts where 98% were getting tenure. Well, the answer is tenure is an automatic. Nobody's evaluating good teachers and bad teachers. And once you get tenure, basically you have a job for life. You cannot, between the union and the tenure, it cost literally, even if you do a really good job of documentation, at least $500,000 to fire a bad teacher for teaching. That this is very sad. So what do we got to look at this and say, hold it, do we need tenure anymore? Because its purpose that it served is no longer there. You just don't arbitrarily fire people anymore. And plus, generally, we have unions, especially in Pennsylvania. That there's, again, real world, if you are good in science and math, you can get a higher pay. Well, then we are right now hurting in science and math, and a tremendous number of our teachers teaching that aren't qualified in it because there aren't enough science and math teachers. It's a thing called supply and demand. Well, therefore, if there's a greater demand to do other things other than teach, then I guess you should pay science and math teachers more and maybe not pay other teachers as much. Wouldn't necessarily have to increase the whole thing. You reshuffle the deck. Right now, they all get paid the same. This doesn't make sense. In the real world, which our government doesn't deal in the real world, you pay for the skill sets you have.
What are some of the other ideas as we work our way to the next area of expenditure?
That basically, we're talking about, again, the real world is all students do not come to school prepared the same. If you have very conscientious parents, and if you have the ability in your house that English is spoken, you come to school with a reasonable amount of skill sets. A fair number of kids come to school being very computer literate. Well, when we start, therefore, we should have 2 curriculums. Those who speak English and those who English is a second language. To expect them both to grow at the same pace, what we've done is we're teaching to the lowest. And actually, this
The
is
lowest common denominator.
the lowest common denominator because there are kids that are far more able to learn because they've had parents that have cared.
And again, this is underlining the important role of parental involvement in preparing your children for education?
In the whole system that we have, kids are going to do what their parents motivate them to do, give them incentives to do. Well, there is different cultures. So if you have a group of kids coming into school, the one can speak perfect English, knows the computer, knows his letters, and so on, and you have another group that very frankly has never done anything and basically has never been encouraged to do anything, you're disservicing both. The one, you're making it so hard that they're going to really dislike school, and the other, they're going to be bored and going to tend not to get the education they should get. So why we can't accept, this is reality. This is where they're coming. The society did not do this, the parents did. And therefore, there should be two curriculums. One curriculum for those who can move faster, and the other curriculum to those who have to, they're starting at the beginning, the absolute beginning.
Get them caught up.
Now, this is considered, well, that's, we're not giving equal. No, they're not equal. They were given equal opportunity, and the parents didn't take advantage of it.
What is the next item? Are there any other items that you have there?
That, well, again, we talked about the whole hours of service in the schools, that there is the cost benefit of this whole situation. So that basically the other one is a question of job training. Right now, 14% of the kids in school are special needs. Mm-hmm. Yet we have now changed our curriculum in education in Pennsylvania at our schools for your degree in education, where every teacher basically must be a special ed teacher. Mm-hmm. This has tied up.
So we're talking about teacher preparation.
Teacher preparation.
Okay.
That a teacher, very frankly,
training.
has got a very narrow education, because if they're going to graduate in 4 years, now you could say, well, then maybe we should make it 5, but if they're going to graduate in 4, they can take very few elective courses. They can't spend a semester overseas, which is something that would be very good for them to be more broad-minded and be better qualified to talk about the real world.
A valuable educational experience.
But basically, what we have done is we've ground them down that they got to take education courses because they got to be special ed qualified. No, let's let special ed again. Teachers that are qualified to do that, and teachers that teach regular classes.
There is a group in America called the Holmes Group, which does advocate a 5-year time period to prepare teachers. So you get your bachelor's degree in what you're going to teach, and you get your bachelor's degree in education, or you get your bachelor's degree in what you're going to teach, and a master's degree in a year and a half.
But you're also
in education.
We argue in this country, and I think it's justified, that a liberal education, which the idea is you're a broad-minded person, you see, let's say, more than just the thing in front of your nose. And basically, because of our curriculum now, we're either forcing a 5-year thing, which in many state schools it is that way, but in your private schools it tends not to be. But really, I can speak at Lebanon Valley College, we encourage our students very strongly to go overseas. A teacher cannot, because the curriculum now, which was just changed in the last year or two, is so overwhelming with the courses you must take because of special ed that they can't possibly go overseas. It's impossible.
Not unless they're going to delay their
Unless they're going to graduate in 5 years, but they
Right.
can't do it in 4.
So in the last four minutes here, how would you summarize education, and what's your next?
The next area, because again, the next biggest cost we have is prisons, and again, correctional institutions. Mm-hmm. This is worst of all. We take this is a $2 billion item, which is 7.3% of our general budget, and it's taken the last one just to mention it. And the other one is a debt service, which is 4%. You add these up. Welfare, education, prisons, and debt service, you're 90%. Well, again, how can we improve our prisons? The prison is not working. It's costing us more and more. It costs more to send a kid to prison than it does to send him to Harvard. This is something wrong. And the outcome is very bad, because the percentage that come out and they go back to prison again.
It's easier to get into prison than into Harvard.
Yeah, well, that's true. The whole thing is, why don't we look at our prisons as two curriculums, you could say. One is violent criminals and one is nonviolent criminals. Well, how do you treat the violent criminal? They're going to spend time in jail, and therefore you should still try to rehab. But in nonviolent, we don't need to spend so much time in prison. They're not a danger to society. If you put them under a house arrest, we have this beautiful technology with these bracelets where they know where you are every second of the time because of all our technology. Obviously, they can now hold a job. learn a job. Part of it would either be job training or working, and they must stay home. So it's still a big inconvenience. Yes, they would spend some time in prison to get the idea that it's not really very nice to break the law.
And some of those GPS technologies also have the ability to tell whether or not the person is, for example, abusing drugs. Lindsay Lohan knows
That's
all
right.
about that.
I mean, here the system was strong enough that it knew that she was doing things wrong when she was in Europe. So not only can this thing tell you where you are, but it can tell you somehow what you're doing. I don't know how. But again, use technology.
So you're saying that we should try to reduce our corrections tab by doing a lot more with at-home incarceration and the separation out of nonviolent offenders.
Well, again, I was told, and I don't know what percentage of these people are pushers, but 72% of the population of Rikers Island were people involved in drugs. Well, if these are people dispossessing drugs, they're not a dangerous society. They should be, again, educated and worked with, but to keep them in prison a long period of time, what is it proving? Use the house restriction, use extensive patrolling, use training, in this case, helping them in the drug area. Teen Challenge is an organization that has actually a 14-month period on drug, which also helps you to get a job, that they're 90% successful in breaking people of drug habits.
And that's a private
private
group.
organization. But basically, again, let's think out this idea of putting people in prison, building more and more prisons is a very expensive and a very failing solution.
Okay. We want to thank you, Mr. Arnold, for being with us for another edition of the Arnold Report. We have a budget here that's coming up for approval. We'll be watching with you to see whether or not it's approved on time and what the final contents of that budget are. And we'll be calling on Mr. Arnold to comment on it in the future. We'll be back again next week with another edition of Behind the Headlines. Follow us on YouTube. Follow our shows that are archived on thevoiceofpa.net. And you can also look at us at Facebook. We'll see you again next week. See you then.
Behind the Headlines is a production of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization helping Pennsylvania build a brighter future.